story of the Titanic sinking is almost something like a great stage play, with a host of rich characters that obsessive nerds like me love to lose ourselves studying. The website Encyclopedia Titanica is a superb reference for this, with hundreds of articles about every single person known to have been aboard the ship. Now, we all know about the unsinkable Molly Brown, the uber-wealthy John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and the migrants, who had left home to start anew across the pond. But one group that is often sorely overlooked is the crew, especially those that survived the disaster. Titanic was a big ship. It needed a small army of people to keep it running. In the event, almost half of all the deaths that night were crew members. So of those that survived the night, what happened afterwards? Were they blamed for the disaster, never to work again, or did they just quit en masse out of protest? Well, the story of what happened to Titanic's remaining crew is a historical saga that's rarely told. Fascinating because for many, the actual sinking of the ship was just the beginning of an immense mental trial. It's a tale that involves corporate greed, government interference, and mutiny. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the story of what happened to Titanic's crew after the ship sank. It's a blustery, rainy night in New York City, and the big Cunard ship Carpathia has just finally tied up at its dock in front of an anxious crowd. It's arrived with over 700 survivors from the sinking of Titanic, and after a few days at sea, the time has come for them to finally disembark. It's a tragic scene, but for many it was just the beginning of what would become a long, drawn-out ordeal. Among all those widows, shattered families, and grieving honeymooners were a gaggle of men and women whose job it had been to actually keep their ship running. Stewards and stewardesses, boiler room firemen, officers, sailors, and many more. They had survived, 212 of them, but 688 of their friends and colleagues had not. It's impossible to imagine exactly what was going through these crew members' minds and what they needed, but we could reasonably guess that the thing they wanted most was to go home, to see their family and friends, to set foot on their native soil. But unfortunately for them, home was still a distant dream. Chairman of the White Star Line, Bruce Ismay, had boarded Carpathia in a near catatonic state, but then he came to his senses. He telegraphed a message to Philip Franklin, the White Star Line's vice president in New York, to hold the company's steamer Cedric in port so it could be loaded with Titanic's surviving crew when Carpathia arrived. Most desirable Titanic crew aboard Carpathia, he had said, should be returned home earliest moment possible. Suggest you hold Cedric, sailing her daylight Friday, unless you see any reason contrary, propose returning in her myself. Now Franklin did not like this idea. We all consider, he said, most unwise delay Cedric considering all circumstances. Unfortunately for Ismay and the crew, the messages were actually intercepted and passed on to authorities in Washington, who had no interest in letting this group of important witnesses go. So it was that when the Carpathia docked in New York on April 18, 1912, representatives from the US government were ready and waiting for their arrival. After Titanic's passengers had got off and some of the media attention was drawn away, the sad procession of crew trod down the aft gangway and aboard a tender boat. They were ordered to go aboard a waiting liner. At Pier 60, not too far from where the Carpathia docked, lay the SS Lapland, flagship of the Red Star Line. Red Star was one of the many shipping lines, including White Star, which had been gobbled up by the International Mercantile Marine, so the companies served alongside each other as something like competitive sister organisations. Lapland, the 605-foot-long, 17,500-ton liner, had arrived in New York days earlier on April 14, at about the same time Titanic had been beginning to slip below the waves. Most of the surviving crew went aboard under the impression they would be heading home within the next day or two. The state of the crew was tragic. All had lost virtually all they owned, and they had only the clothes that were on their backs. Their pay had stopped the moment Titanic sank. Now, they were ordered by the White Star Line to sit tight while preparations could be made to get them back to England in seclusion aboard the big Red Star ship. Crucially, this prevented them from speaking to the press. Charities ashore rushed to their assistance. The Women's Relief Committee, for example, gathered together spare clothes for the stewardesses and provided an impressive amount, totaling more than $2,500, a small fortune at the time, to be split between the crew. They attended a memorial service but were hurried away at the end to get them out of the clutches of the press. They had their orders, one survivor said. They knew what was best for them and they didn't propose to lose the chance of a job on top of all they had suffered in the last week. But the crew were not happy. "We," said one, who saved immigrant women and their children, "we get nothing. It ain't fair. It's unfair." That's what I call it. When Carpathia had docked, Michigan Senator William Alden Smith and his team had pounced, serving subpoenas to the surviving crew members alongside Ismay almost immediately. They were required to appear and testify in the United States inquiry into the Titanic disaster, and shockingly, the investigation would begin the very next day. Now, we've covered the Titanic inquiries in a previous video. The American one was a bizarre affair, but as a refresher, the US inquiry lasted from April 19th all the way through to May 25th. They called about 82 witnesses in total, which included 4 of Titanic's surviving officers, as well as 34 additional crew members. Testimony famously came from Bruce Ismay, Harold Bride, the wireless operator, Charles Lightoller, second officer, and many more. But much to the dismay of the British government and those homesick people who just wanted to go home, the crew was held in New York and not allowed to leave the country under threat of arrest. Now, the British government was set to hold its own inquiry, beginning a few weeks later on May 2nd. That would last for over a month and feature 28 days of testimony. Clearly, there was a long, winding road ahead for the very weary crew of Titanic. The 2 inquiries were certainly not without a purpose. Information gathered from them helped piece together the tragic events of the night and contributed to some new safety regulations at sea. But the second inquiry also served to largely absolve the British merchant marine and the shipbuilding industry and the Board of Trade as a whole in a sweeping whitewash that we plan to cover in detail in a future video as well. It had to be done, yet few could imagine the mental anguish of surviving a disaster and then having to retell it just days later with no promise of ever returning home. At the US Senate inquiry, the testifying crew had to listen with frustration to people who had already made up their own minds as to what happened that night, with all the rumors, misconceptions, and even attacks on their own capability. Those days in New York must have felt like a lifetime. Finally, on April 20th, 1912, 5 days after Titanic had disappeared, it was mercifully time for many of the surviving crew to begin their journey home. Titanic had been registered to Liverpool. That great seafaring city has a long and fruitful maritime tradition. It's where the White Star Line was headquartered. But in fact, Ismay and Co. had shifted operations for the company's biggest liners down to the town of Southampton. A clever move that meant ships leaving there could swing down to Europe briefly, calling in France at Cherbourg to take on more passengers before heading out for good. It was a clever business maneuver, but it also meant a huge number of Titanic's crew were disproportionately drawn from that town. Around 4 in every 5 Titanic crew members came from Southampton. That meant when the death notices were finally posted, the city was absolutely devastated. In some suburbs, there was hardly a street that didn't lose a handful of fathers, brothers, husbands, and wives. It was a kind of localized devastation that hadn't really been seen before and would only be seen again during the World Wars. But it meant that one city alone had lost more than 500 of its people. Those that survived numbered just around 178, and in Southampton's streets there was tragic, pitiable scenes as the names were read out and the worst was realised in household after household. For those that knew their loved ones had lived came the pain of now having to wait. Of course, there was only one way for them to get back, and it was by sea aboard another ship. Lapland was chartered with the job of returning home about 150 of Titanic's 212 surviving crew. They mustered in steerage after a dizzying week, dressed in new civilian clothes from the New York charities. Lapland set off, but then came a moment of drama. Robert Hitchens, Titanic's quartermaster, who'd actually been at the ship's wheel when the iceberg was spotted, had somehow been allowed to go aboard Lapland and leave. An urgent wireless message brought Lapland to a stop while a tug set out to bring Hitchens off and supply him back to the inquiry. But still, about 24 of Titanic's crew remained behind in New York as well. One quit the line outright. The rest were bundled aboard the liner Celtic and put under close guard, warned that they would be fired if they spoke with the press. At sea, Lapland cut her way through the chilly Atlantic. her holds laden with nearly 2,000 sacks of mail that was supposed to be delivered back to Britain by Titanic. For the crew finally going home, it must have been a huge relief. But unfortunately, it was one that was all too short-lived. Just one day out from arrival, a press story ran with this frustrating news. It is anticipated, they said, at Plymouth, that when the Red Star liner Lapland, on board of which are those of the survivors of the Titanic's crew who are not required to give evidence at the Washington inquiry, arrive tomorrow, the men will not be sent off at once to their homes, as was at first thought, but will be persuaded to remain at the docks until they've been interrogated by the company's officials. The crew aboard Lapland weren't told. They arrived at Plymouth excited to get off the ship and into the arms of their loved ones. You can only imagine the mood when that didn't pan out. On April 28th, the Lapland arrived at Plymouth, watched by thousands of pairs of eyes on shore and on a small fleet of boats out to meet her. The news had been a shock to the British public, and the arrival of this big ship with its contingent of survivors was a big draw for everyday people and the press alike. It might have started off as an exciting day for the crew to begin with, but reality soon dawned when they realised they weren't allowed to go home. The order hadn't come from the White Star Line, but the Board of Trade, who made it clear they would need to take the deposition of each and every member of Titanic's surviving crew. They were all detained once again. Now, they trod down gangways aboard 3 small tender boats, which came out to meet them, and they were handed a simple, heartbreaking notice. It said, "Take notice, you are hereby detained as a witness at the forthcoming Board of Trade inquiry concerning the loss of the steamship Titanic from April 28th inclusive." This demand was met, to put it quite mildly, rather unfavourably. Now 13 days removed from Titanic's sinking, crew members were still being held back from their families, and their ordeal continued on. Alongside one of the small tenders, though, came an even smaller sailing boat with red sails. This small intruder would soon scupper the Board of Trade's plans, because aboard it were important sailors' union leaders, keen to make sure their men were being taken care of. They shouted out to the crew as they boarded the tenders not to talk to anybody. "Ask for your union officials," they called, "before you say a word." Any blind obedience of the Board of Trade's orders by Titanic's crew was brought into sudden, stark question. At last, a pair of the union officials was let aboard one of the small tenders, because none of the survivors would talk with anybody without speaking to them first. They came aboard, and they had some shocking news. Olympic, Titanic's sister, had suffered a mutiny when her crew members there had looked appalled as substandard, creaky, collapsible lifeboats were hastily loaded so that she could continue on her regular schedule. Now this, of course, was not good enough. It reinforced in the minds of Titanic's crew that the company obviously did not have their best interests at heart. "What we agreed to," said one, "was cooperation, not compulsion. We gave all the evidence they want, and you may depend upon it, the men will go considerably out of their way to give it, but we give it as free citizens, not as inferiors." Tense discussion took place aboard as the tender boat, the Sir Richard Grenville, sailed aimlessly about the bay, when finally a middle ground was reached, and the boat was tied up alongside the pier. At last, Titanic's surviving crew from that boat stepped foot upon British soil, their homeland, to a cheer from spectators who'd watched the tender doing circles for about 3 hours. The crew trudged into a makeshift canteen and dormitory and called greetings and news to the gathered crowd outside through open windows and dock gates. When asked about a friend, one called back, "No, he's gone." "Is all well at home, mother?" called another. "Joe's gone," shouted one. "The boat wouldn't come back to him when he was swimming." Brothers, friends, sweethearts, they were all reunited, but from a distance, as they shouted out to one another while the situation was worked out. The British Seafarers Union sent an urgent cable. "To Sir Walter Howe, Board of Trade," it began, "crew of Titanic being detained as prisoners, we demand their immediate release." Finally, the plan to detain them for any serious amount of time was abandoned. They were given a meal, some statements were taken, and then told they could leave if they wished, but only 20 talked. They were paid, and many set off for Southampton by special train. It arrived at long last after 10 p.m. The crowd, 200 or 300 strong who were waiting, cheered, and whipped up a cry of excitement as the men, described as looking, understandably, haggard and worn, trod off the train and into the waiting arms of loved ones and dear friends. One reporter noted, a little schoolgirl ran down the platform to jump in her father's arms and then, laughing and crying, dragged him to her mother, and while the parents embraced, the little girl danced round them in an ecstasy of joy. For these members of Titanic's beleaguered crew, the ordeal was over. over 500 households across Southampton were not so fortunate. Their anguish and grief was only just beginning. One elderly woman found her son and asked, "John, where is your kit?" He laughed and asked what it mattered, at least he was alive. But it was a good question. The crew had lost virtually everything they had. On the night of the sinking, surviving members of Titanic's crew had boarded the lifeboats with very few, if any, of their personal belongings. When the ship sank, it took everything they had with it to the bottom of the Atlantic. While losing their possessions was probably the least of their worries that night, the reality was that everything would need to be replaced, and for many of the crew, their wages just wouldn't allow for it. To make things worse, a cruel regulation meant that their pay had stopped when Titanic sank. Now, it's a common myth that the White Star Line stopped paying the crew immediately at the time of the sinking, but the truth is this wasn't actually just a policy of the White Star Line itself. The pay stopped, actually, thanks to regulations set by the British Board of Trade, which themselves were based on old Royal Navy codes. Essentially, people were paid to be the crew of a ship. Once the ship was gone, there was nothing to crew any longer, and the pay would stop. Now, we've covered the Titanic settlement stories before, but eventually the White Star Line did pay the surviving crew and dependents of the deceased a bonus, which covered the wages they would have earned had Titanic arrived in New York as expected. For those that returned to England aboard the Lapland, they were also paid to cover the extra 2 weeks they were away from home. And for the crew that had to stay back in New York even longer to testify at the inquiry, they were paid even more. The happy reunions at the train station that night were followed eventually by others when stewards and stewardesses were released, and again in the coming weeks when those testifying in the US were allowed, at last, to come home. But a pall of sorrow hung over Southampton. One reporter said the city was black and is in an extraordinary state of mental unrest and emotion. If it had been shaken by an earthquake, it could hardly show more signs of being badly disturbed, anxious, and fearful. There are so many women in black here, and a large portion of them widows, that a stranger who had never heard of the Titanic would know the place had met calamity. So, what happened next? Well, even as inquiries went on and then ended, life just had to move on. You'd imagine that for the surviving crew, the idea of going back to sea would surely be too much. But not only did most surviving members of Titanic's crew continue to work aboard ocean liners, many also continued to do so for the White Star Line aboard Titanic's sister Olympic specifically. Now, we've covered before in some detail the post-Titanic career of her surviving officers. All of them, 2nd Officer Lightoller, 3rd Officer Pittman, 4th Officer Boxall and 5th Officer Lowe, continued a career at sea and worked still for the White Star Line. They were hardly alone in this, although they would never hold a command of their own in the employ of that company. Some of the crew stories after Titanic are almost stranger than fiction. Violet Jessop, for example, she's the most famous crew member of Titanic's outside her officers. She was no stranger to the White Star Line and no stranger to surviving improbable odds. As a child, she had survived a shocking bout of tuberculosis. After her own mother grew ill, Violet served as a stewardess for the Royal Mail Line before joining White Star. She was with the Olympic and was on board at the time of the ship's collision with the warship HMS Hawke in 1911. Despite the accident, Jessop enjoyed her time aboard the Olympic and was hesitant to transfer to a new ship, Titanic, but she was encouraged to do so by friends. Violet left Titanic on the night of the sinking in lifeboat number 16, and a few years later she was serving the British Red Cross during World War I as a nurse aboard Titanic's sister ship, Britannic, when that ship too struck a mine and sank off the coast of Greece. She narrowly survived, but despite now having been involved in 3 White Star Line incidents, Violet continued to be employed by the company before she switched to the Red Star and then later the Royal Mail Line. It seems there was nothing to discourage Violet Jessop from spending life on the ocean. She even completed 2 around-the-world voyages. But, somewhat inconceivably, Violet was joined by 2 others with very similar stories. Archie Jewell was well familiar with working on ships because he'd been serving on sailing ships since the young age of 15. He joined the White Star Line in 1904 and served on the Oceanic for years before he signed on to Titanic as one of the ship's 6 lookouts. 4 years later, he was also serving on Britannic as a maintenance worker when she sank. Jewell survived that sinking as well. He would later leave the White Star Line but continue to work at sea. Unfortunately, disaster would finally catch up with him. Like Britannic, the steamer SS Donegal was converted to a hospital ship during the First World War. Jewell was aboard when the ship was hit by a torpedo and sunk by the German U-boat UC-21, and tragically, he did not survive. Amazingly, Titanic fireman Arthur John Priest was aboard Donegal as well. He was even aboard Olympic the day she collided with Hawke. In 1916, he was a fireman aboard the Alcantara when she was sunk in action. Incredibly, he then went on to board Britannic and survived that sinking as well. Priest seemed to have similar luck to Jessup though, because he then went aboard another ship that was torpedoed and sunk, the SS Donegal, but he survived that one too. Tragically, the First World War would claim many of the lives that had survived the Titanic sinking. One was Edward John Buell. He'd served at sea ever since he was a young boy. He was aboard Titanic as a seaman, assisting greatly with the evacuation manning the davits. He was even one of the crewmen of the only boat which returned to the scene of the wreck to search for survivors in the water. They managed to save only 4. Buell testified in both inquiries, giving gripping and detailed testimony, insisting that the ship clearly broke in two on her way down. He would re-enlist in the Navy during the First World War, but was killed when serving on the destroyer HMS Partridge when she was sunk in action in 1916. William Pusey was another. He had been a fireman aboard Titanic. Years later, he was aboard HMS Dirk, a patrol boat that was torpedoed and sunk by another U-boat, and he was lost in the sinking as well. The truth of the matter is that many simply did not have the ability to just up and leave the employ of big shipping lines. Many had served aboard ships since childhood. Life at sea was all that they knew. The truth is that in many ways, wrecks and danger were simply occupational hazards, a seemingly unlikely eventuality which everybody accepted when they signed on to a new ship. Today, we idolise Titanic as if it were the only ship to have ever been lost. This channel's definitely guilty of that. But the truth is, countless hundreds and thousands of ships have been lost in storms, groundings, torpedo attacks. It was just how life at sea was, and the crews back then just had to get on with the job. Titanic's surviving crew members were treated terribly, both by the company that employed them and by the government of the nation they represented. The moment Titanic was lost, they became a kind of embarrassing living evidence of the tragedy, a stain on the proud tradition of the British merchant marine. They were sequestered away like guilty parties, barred from moving freely or talking to the press, detained like criminals on both sides of the Atlantic. At the inquiry, much of their testimony was just ignored. When many gave accounts of having seen the ship break apart, the findings had been that the ship had really sunk in one piece and they didn't know what they were seeing. The British inquiry blamed the ship's officers and crew for the disaster, but it essentially let the builders and designers at Harland & Wolff, her captain, and the Board of Trade itself off the hook entirely. It found that the ship's officers had been complacent, but at the same time found that Captain Smith was doing, quote, only that which other skilled men would have done in the same position, seemingly glossing entirely over the point that Smith was head of his officers and men, and any complacency must have landed squarely at his feet. The lookouts in the crow's nest were grilled about every detail, their eyesight, how soon they'd spotted the iceberg, their very competence. But nobody dared question why Smith had failed to post extra eyes forward to help them out. The same inquiry that found anybody, regardless of class, aboard the ship had equal opportunity to board a lifeboat, had ignored completely the simple layout of the liner. That third class and crew were berthed hundreds of feet away and stories below where the boats were kept. Between them and safety was a maze of corridors, staircases, and gates. The Edwardian Age was still an era of vast inequality for workers in many industries. It would take some time yet for basic rights that we today take for granted to become the norm. The story of Titanic's surviving crew is heartrending because these were just honest, hard-working people thrust suddenly into terrifying circumstances only to be treated with suspicion and disdain by the system which had killed so many of their friends and colleagues. The golden age of the ocean liner is a romantic one, and the Titanic story has plenty of elegance and romance attached to it, for sure. But we also have to temper that kind of thinking with the harsh realities, that times were tough and companies only acted in their best interests. The attitude of the times can maybe be best summed up by this letter, which was written to the brother of Titanic's most junior officer, James Moody. While we will be prepared, it said, to transport the remains of your brother across the Atlantic to either Liverpool or Southampton, we regret that it is not possible for us to do any more. Should you, after further consideration, desire the remains of your brother to be returned, will you kindly telegraph us in the morning at the same time sending us a deposit of £20, it's about £2,000 today, or nearly $3,000 US, for any expenses and land charges on the other side and we will at once cable New York asking them to arrange if possible. We also think it right to point out that the arrangements and expenses for taking charge of the remains after arrival of the steamer at Liverpool or Southampton would be on your account. While sympathising with your inclination, we trust, however, that you will eventually decide to allow the remains to be interred with the others, which we can assure you will be carried out on your behalf by our people with all due reverence. And if you would care for a photograph of the grave, or if there are some words you would like included on the tombstone, we shall be happy to have your wish complied with on hearing from you. Yours faithfully, Ismay, Imrie & Co. James Moody was only 24 when he died. He had worked like a lion all night to get the lifeboats away, and then, when offered a place in a boat himself, he stepped aside so another officer could get in instead. He was swept away when the ship took her final plunge, his final act being to try to get a collapsible away from the deck before it floated clean off. At first, it had been listed that he had survived, but then came the telegrams talking about repatriating his body. The horrible truth came later. He hadn't even been recovered. It was a cruel mistake. The same company whose dying ship Moody had fought so hard to evacuate of passengers and simply offered his brother a photo of the mass grave that Moody would be buried in, only they didn't even actually have his body at all. He was never found. So that's the sad tale of Titanic's crew. If you're interested in learning more about this saga, I highly recommend Dr. Paul Lee's book, The Homecoming, Tales from the Lapland, which is chock full of survivor accounts and plenty of juicy details about that sad voyage to Plymouth and the tense standoff afterward. In fact, many of the accounts listed in the book by Dr. Lee's research were included in this script for this video. You can find it on Amazon, and I'll include a link in the description below. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.